Woman finds injured orange cat after landslide. What happens next surprises everyone. The rain had been relentless, a torrential downpour that had hammered the small town of Havenwood, nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, for 3 days straight. The creek that usually babbled peacefully through the valley had become a raging torrent, and the hillsides, saturated with water, had begun to groan under the strain. Landslides were a constant threat in this part of West Virginia, a fact of life that the residents had learned to live with, but this storm felt different, more ominous. Sarah Miller, 35, lived in a small, sturdy cabin halfway up one of the hillsides. She'd inherited the cabin from her grandmother, and it was her sanctuary, a place of peace and solitude where she could escape the pressures of her life as a freelance graphic designer. She loved the quiet beauty of the mountains, the close-knit community of Havenwood, and the sense of connection to nature that surrounded her. On the third night of the storm, Sarah was awakened by a deafening roar. The ground shook, the windows rattled, and she felt a sickening lurch as if the entire cabin was shifting. She scrambled out of bed, her heart pounding, and peered out the window. In the flickering light of a lightning flash, she saw it. A massive section of the hillside above her had given way, a cascade of mud, rocks, and trees tumbling down towards the town below. The power went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and her phone, but there was no cell service. She felt a surge of fear, not just for herself, but for her neighbors, for the people of Havenwood. As the storm raged on, she could only wait, listening to the terrifying sounds of a landslide, praying that everyone was safe. Finally, as dawn broke, the rain began to ease, and the roar of the landslide subsided. Sarah cautiously ventured outside, her boots sinking into the thick mud. The landscape had been transformed. Trees were uprooted, roads were blocked, and a thick layer of debris covered everything. Her own cabin had been spared, miraculously, but the devastation below was heartbreaking. She made her way down the hill, carefully navigating the treacherous terrain. She saw other residents emerging from their homes, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. The town was in chaos. Emergency vehicles were struggling to reach the area, hampered by the blocked roads. As Sarah reached the lower part of town, near where the landslide had come to rest, she saw a group of people gathered, their voices hushed with concern. She approached, her heart heavy with dread. "What is it?" she asked. A neighbor, old Mr. Henderson, pointed towards a jumble of rocks and mud. "There's something trapped under there," he said. "We heard it whimpering." Sarah pushed her way to the front of the group. She could hear it now, a faint, pitiful sound, barely audible above the murmur of voices and the dripping of water. She knelt down, peering into the crevices between the rocks. And then she saw it. A flash of orange fur, matted with mud and blood. A small, injured cat, barely visible, trapped beneath the debris. Sarah didn't hesitate. She started pulling away rocks, ignoring the protests of the others who warned her about the instability of the pile. She had to get to the cat. After what seemed like an eternity, she managed to create a small opening. She reached in, gently coaxing the cat out. It was a young adult, its orange fur caked with mud, its body trembling. It was covered in cuts and bruises, and one of its legs was clearly broken. The cat let out a weak meow, its eyes filled with pain and fear. Sarah carefully lifted it out of the debris, cradling it in her arms. It was barely conscious. "We need to get into a vet," she said, her voice trembling. "He's badly hurt." But the roads were impassable, and the nearest veterinary clinic was miles away. Sarah knew she had to do something, and she had to do it fast. She decided to take the cat back to her cabin, to clean its wounds and keep it warm until help could arrive. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance the cat had. Back at her cabin, Sarah set to work. She gently cleaned the cat's wounds with warm water and antiseptic, her hands moving with a practiced tenderness. She wrapped the injured leg in a makeshift splint, using a small piece of wood and some bandages from her first aid kit. The cat, whom she decided to call Rusty, remained remarkably docile throughout the ordeal, as if sensing that she was trying to help. He lay on a soft blanket on her kitchen table, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow but steady. As she worked, Sarah began to notice things about Rusty that didn't quite add up. He was clearly not a feral cat. His fur, though matted with mud, was thick and well-groomed, suggesting he'd been cared for. He was also surprisingly calm, despite his injuries and the unfamiliar surroundings. Most strays would be frantic, terrified, but Rusty seemed resigned, almost trusting. And then there was his behavior. As he started to regain some strength, he didn't act like a typical cat. He didn't explore the cabin, didn't jump on furniture, didn't show any interest in the usual feline pursuits. Instead, he moved cautiously, sniffing the floor, the walls, the doorways, as if he were trying to orient himself in a strange environment. He seemed particularly interested in the edges of the rooms, the transitions between spaces. He also reacted strongly to certain sounds. The ringing of Sarah's phone startled him, but the sound of her voice, speaking calmly, seemed to soothe him. He responded to hand gestures, almost as if he understood them. Sarah started to wonder, could Rusty be more than just a stray? Could he be a lost pet, perhaps one with special training? The thought flickered in her mind, but she dismissed it as unlikely. How could a trained animal end up injured and alone after a landslide? She made Rusty a comfortable bed in a cardboard box lined with soft towels. She placed a bowl of water and some soft cat food nearby, but he showed little interest in eating. He seemed exhausted, his body depleted from the trauma. Sarah spent the rest of the day caring for Rusty, checking his wounds, offering him water, and simply sitting with him, talking softly, stroking his fur. She felt a growing connection to this injured creature, a sense of responsibility, a deep empathy for his suffering. As evening approached, Sarah tried calling the local animal shelter again, but the lines were still down. She knew she was on her own, at least for the night. She made herself a simple dinner, but she had little appetite. Her mind was preoccupied with Rusty, with the mystery of his unusual behavior, with a nagging feeling that there was something more to his story. She settled down in her armchair, a book in her lap, but she couldn't concentrate. She kept glancing at Rusty, who was sleeping fitfully in his box. She noticed that he seemed to be having nightmares, his paws twitching, his body trembling. She reached out and gently stroked his head, whispering soothing words. He calmed down, his breathing becoming more regular. As she sat there, in the quiet of her cabin, listening to the gentle rhythm of Rusty's breathing, Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just the storm, the landslide, or the devastation she'd witnessed. It was something about Rusty, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. It was a whisper of a mystery, a hint of something extraordinary, and it wouldn't let her rest. It felt as if the cat had a story that he couldn't tell. A sense of foreboding passed through her as she looked forward to the coming days. Part 3, the guide revealed. The next morning, Rusty was slightly more alert, though still weak and in obvious pain. He managed to lap up a little water and even nibbled on some of the soft food Sarah offered him. Sarah was encouraged by his progress, but her concerns about his unusual behavior persisted. She decided to try a few simple tests. She held out her hand, palm down, a few inches from Rusty's face. He instinctively leaned into her touch, a gesture that seemed more like a learned response than a natural feline behavior. Then, she tried walking slowly around the room, deliberately changing direction, pausing, and starting again. Rusty watched her intently, his head following her movements, his body subtly shifting as if he were anticipating her next step. It was almost as if he was guiding her. A sudden thought struck Sarah, a realization that sent a shiver down her spine. Could Rusty be a guide animal? A cat trained to assist a person with a disability, most likely someone visually impaired? The idea seemed far-fetched, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. It explained Rusty's calm demeanor, his unusual attentiveness, his reactions to sounds and hand gestures. It explained why he seemed so lost and disoriented, why he was sniffing the edges of the rooms, trying to map out his surroundings. If Rusty was a guide cat, then where was his owner? Had they been separated during the landslide? Were they injured, Perhaps even Sarah pushed the thought away, unwilling to contemplate the worst. She knew she needed to find out more. She tried calling the animal shelter again, and this time, she got through. She explained her theory to the shelter worker, describing Rusty's behavior and his injuries. The shelter worker was intrigued. "It's unusual," she said, "but not impossible. We've heard of guide cats, though they're much rarer than guide dogs. We've had a lot of reports of lost pets since the landslide. I'll put out an alert, and we'll see if anyone reports a missing guide cat." Sarah also contacted the local police department and the Red Cross, which was coordinating the relief efforts in Havenwood. She described Rusty and his possible training, hoping that someone might recognize him or know his owner. Later that day, a volunteer from the Red Cross, a middle-aged woman named Susan Baker, stopped by Sarah's cabin. Susan was helping to compile a list of missing persons and displaced families. "We've had a few reports of people separated from their service animals," Susan said, "but mostly dogs. A guide cat, that's a new one." She examined Rusty, noting his calm demeanor and his responsiveness to Sarah's voice and touch. "He certainly acts like he's had some kind of training," she said. "Do you mind if I take a few pictures? I'll circulate them among the other volunteers and at the emergency shelters." Sarah readily agreed. She felt a growing sense of urgency, a desperate need to find Rusty's owner. She couldn't imagine the fear and helplessness they must be feeling, separated from their trusted companion, their guide, their lifeline. As Susan was leaving, she said, "There's a man staying at the emergency shelter at the high school. He's blind, and he lost his dog in the landslide. He's been asking about any reports of found animals. Maybe it's worth a shot." Sarah's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Could this be Rusty's owner? She had to find out. She knew she wouldn't rest until she did everything she could to reunite this extraordinary cat with the person who needed him most. The thought of that reunion, of the joy it would bring, filled her with a renewed determination. It was a long shot, a very long shot, but she had to try. The emergency shelter at Havenwood High School was a scene of organized chaos. Cots were lined up in the gymnasium, families huddled together, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion. Volunteers bustled about, distributing food, water, and blankets. The air hummed with the murmur of voices, the cries of children, and the occasional bark of a dog. Sarah, with Rusty carefully secured in a carrier, felt a wave of emotion as she entered the shelter. The scale of the disaster, the human cost, was overwhelming. She approached the information desk, her heart pounding. "I'm looking for a man," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He's blind, and he lost his service animal in the landslide. I was told he might be here." The volunteer at the desk, a young man with a tired but kind face, consulted a list. "Yes," he said, "Mr. Thomas Ashton. He's in the far corner, near the windows. He lost his guide dog, a golden retriever named Buddy." Sarah felt a pang of disappointment. It wasn't a cat, but she still felt compelled to speak with Mr. Ashton. Perhaps he'd heard something, seen something, that could help her find Rusty's owner. She made her way through the crowded gymnasium, her eyes scanning the faces of the displaced families. She found Mr. Ashton sitting alone on a cot, his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He was an elderly man, probably in his late 70s, with a weathered face and a shock of white hair. He looked utterly lost and defeated. Sarah approached him cautiously. "Mr. Ashton," she said softly. He looked up, his unseeing eyes searching for the source of the sound. "Yes. My name is Sarah Miller. I live up on the hillside. I found a cat after the landslide. He's injured, but he seems to be well. He seems to be trained." Mr. Ashton's expression didn't change. "A cat," he said, his voice flat. "I lost my dog, Buddy. He was my guide." "I know," Sarah said. "But this cat, he's different. He behaves like a service animal. I thought maybe you'd heard something, seen something." Mr. Ashton shook his head. "I haven't seen anything in years," he said, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "And I certainly haven't heard anything about a guide cat. They're very rare." Sarah hesitated, unsure of what to say. She didn't want to raise his hopes falsely, But she couldn't shake the feeling that Rusty was connected to someone in this room, someone who needed him desperately. She decided to take a chance. Would you mind just meeting him? She asked. Just to be sure. Mr. Ashton sighed, a sound of weary resignation. I suppose it can't hurt, he said. Sarah opened the carrier and gently lifted Rusty out. The cat, usually calm, seemed to sense the tension in the air. He let out a soft meow, a questioning sound. Sarah placed Rusty on the floor near Mr. Ashton's feet. He's orange, she said. A young adult. He has a presence about him. Mr. Ashton slowly reached down, his hand trembling slightly. He touched Rusty's fur, gently stroking his back. Rusty, instead of backing away, leaned into the touch, purring softly. Then, something extraordinary happened. Rusty, as if guided by an invisible force, moved closer to Mr. Ashton. He sniffed his hand, his leg, and then, with a sudden, deliberate movement, he rubbed his head against Mr. Ashton's shin, a clear gesture of affection and recognition. Mr. Ashton froze. His hand stopped moving. He slowly lifted his head, his unseeing eyes wide with disbelief. Jasper, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Is that you? Rusty Jasper let out a series of loud, insistent meows, a sound that was unmistakably a greeting, a confirmation. He rubbed against Mr. Ashton's legs again and again, purring furiously. Tears streamed down Mr. Ashton's face. He reached down and scooped Jasper into his arms, burying his face in his fur. He held the cat close, his body shaking with sobs. Jasper, he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. Oh, Jasper, I thought I'd lost you forever. Sarah watched the reunion, tears welling up in her own eyes. The scene before her was so powerful, so moving, that it took her breath away. The bond between this man and his cat was undeniable, a testament to the extraordinary connection that can exist between humans and animals. It turned out that Mr. Ashton had been visiting his sister, who lived in a small cottage at the foot of the hill when the landslide hit. He'd been walking with Jasper, his guide cat of 3 years, when the ground gave way. He'd been knocked unconscious, and when he'd come to, Jasper was gone. He'd been frantic, calling for him, searching blindly, but the chaos and the debris had made it impossible to find him. He'd been rescued by emergency workers and brought to the shelter, heartbroken and utterly lost without his faithful companion. He explained that Jasper wasn't just a pet. He was his lifeline, his independence. He'd been trained by a specialized organization that provided guide cats to people with visual impairments. Jasper was his eyes, his guide, his constant companion. He'd felt utterly helpless and vulnerable without him. The story of the reunion spread quickly through the shelter, bringing a wave of joy and relief to the weary residents. People gathered around Mr. Ashton and Jasper, marveling at the cat's loyalty and the incredible bond they shared. It was a moment of light and hope amidst the darkness and despair. Sarah, standing quietly to the side, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She played a small part in this miracle, in bringing this man and his beloved cat back together. It was a reminder of the power of compassion, the importance of helping others, and the extraordinary resilience of both humans and animals. As the initial excitement subsided, Sarah approached Mr. Ashton. I'm so glad you found him, she said, her voice filled with emotion. He's a very special cat. Mr. Ashton looked up at her, his eyes still wet with tears, but now shining with a newfound light. He is, he said. He's my everything. And you saved him. You saved us. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me, Sarah said. I just did what anyone would have done. No, Mr. Ashton said, shaking his head. You went above and beyond. You cared. You persisted. You brought us back together. I'll never forget that. He reached out and took Sarah's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. Thank you, he said again, his voice filled with sincerity. Sarah squeezed his hand, her heart overflowing with emotion. She'd come to Havenwood seeking peace and solitude, but she'd found something even more profound, a connection to a community, a sense of purpose, and a reminder of the enduring power of love and loyalty. In the weeks that followed, Havenwood slowly began to recover from the devastation of the landslide. Homes were rebuilt, roads were cleared, and the community came together to support those who had lost everything. The spirit of resilience, of neighbor helping neighbor, was palpable. Mr. Ashton, with Jasper safely by his side, moved back into his sister's cottage, which had sustained only minor damage. He was a changed man. The loss and fear he'd experienced had been replaced by a profound gratitude, a renewed appreciation for life, and a deeper bond than ever with his extraordinary guide cat. Jasper, too, seemed to have recovered from his injuries. He was a little more cautious, a little more clingy to Mr. Ashton, but his spirit was unbroken. He resumed his duties as a guide cat with his usual diligence and devotion, leading Mr. Ashton through the recovering town, navigating the obstacles, and providing a constant source of comfort and companionship. Sarah became a frequent visitor to Mr. Ashton's cottage. She developed a genuine friendship with both him and Jasper. She'd bring them treats, help with errands, and simply spend time talking, sharing stories, and enjoying their company. She learned more about Mr. Ashton's life, his career as a music teacher before he lost his sight, his love for his late wife, and his deep bond with Jasper. She also learned more about the organization that had trained Jasper, Feline Guides of America. It was a small, non-profit organization dedicated to training cats to assist people with visual impairments. They were relatively unknown, as guide cats were still quite rare, but their work was groundbreaking and incredibly impactful. Sarah, inspired by Mr. Ashton and Jasper's story, decided to become more involved with Feline Guides of America. She started volunteering her time, helping with fundraising, public awareness, and even fostering kittens that were in training. She found a new sense of purpose in this work, a way to give back to the community and to honor the extraordinary bond she'd witnessed between a man and his cat. The story of Mr. Ashton and Jasper's reunion became a local legend, a symbol of hope and resilience in the aftermath of the disaster. It was featured in the local newspaper and even made it onto a regional news broadcast. People were touched by the story, by the loyalty of the cat, the determination of the woman who rescued him, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his guide. Havenwood, though scarred by the landslide, emerged stronger and more united than ever. The disaster had brought people together, fostering a sense of community and a shared commitment to rebuilding their lives and their town. The spirit of compassion and resilience that had been sparked by a small, injured orange cat had spread throughout the community, creating a ripple effect of kindness and hope. Sarah, who had once sought solitude in the quiet hills of West Virginia, found herself deeply embedded in the fabric of Havenwood. She was no longer an outsider, a newcomer. She was a part of the community, a friend, a neighbor, a valued member of the town. She'd found a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she was missing. One sunny afternoon, several months after the landslide, Sarah was walking through the town square with Mr. Ashton and Jasper. They were on their way to the local park, where a community picnic was being held to celebrate the town's recovery. As they walked, Jasper, ever vigilant, guided Mr. Ashton safely along the sidewalk, avoiding obstacles, navigating the crowds. Sarah watched them, her heart filled with warmth and admiration. "You know," she said to Mr. Ashton, "I never thought I'd be a cat person." Mr. Ashton smiled. "Life is full of surprises," he said, "and sometimes the greatest blessings come in the most unexpected packages." He reached down and stroked Jasper's fur. The cat purred contentedly, leaning into his touch. "Jasper didn't just save my life," Mr. Ashton said. "He gave me a new one. You both reminded me that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope, there's always love, and there's always a reason to keep going." Sarah smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. She knew he was right. The landslide had been a tragedy, a devastating event that had changed their lives forever. But it had also brought them together, forged unexpected connections, and revealed the enduring power of the human and animal spirit. And in the quiet, resilient town of Havenwood, life, like the wildflowers blooming on the recovering hillsides, was blossoming anew.